Before I even arrive at the Oval Office, I will have the disastrous war between Russia and Ukraine settled. And it will take me no longer than one day.
Donald Trump there was promising to swiftly end Russia's war on Ukraine as tens of thousands of Russian soldiers prepare for a large-scale assault against Ukrainian positions in the Kursk region. Those Russian forces joined by thousands of North Korean troops. The offensive expected to begin within days, and it comes as questions swirl about Ukraine's future with Trump in office. The Biden administration arguing that abandoning Ukraine now will have global implications.
President Biden will have the opportunity over the next 70 days to make the case to the Congress and to the incoming administration that the United States should not walk away from Ukraine, that walking away from Ukraine means more instability in Europe. And ultimately, as the Japanese prime minister said, if we walk away from Ukraine in Europe, the question about America's commitment to our allies in Asia will grow.
On Wednesday, President Biden will host Trump at the White House, plans to urge him to stand by Ukraine. CNN military analyst Colonel Cedric Leighton is here. Colonel, good morning. Always wonderful to see you.
Good morning, Casey.
So I have to say, looking at that, the map especially, and thinking through the Russian offensive at this point, do you get the sense that Russia wants to try to make this offensive? Now, obviously, holding territory has been difficult for them. This has been a long war of attrition for the Russians. But with Trump coming into office, is there like a willingness, or do they sense a willingness to basically draw lines around where the front is at the moment that Trump comes into office and say, this is how we resolve this?
I'm not sure it'll be at that particular point. The key question, I think, will be how will the North Korean soldiers be employed? So we have about 10 or 11,000 that are in the Kursk region. If they pursue a strategy of hot pursuit, in other words, cross the Ukrainian border, that's a different question then. Then it becomes one of those situations where the Russians are bent on more territorial gains than they currently have. So I'm not sure it's actually going to be as, when Trump assumes office, or whether it's now, or whether it's a place where the Russians are going to actually have an advantage territorially, in other words, gain more territory than what they already have. And that's probably going to be what the Russians are going to try to do.
So let's listen to the former Trump administration special envoy to Ukraine, who was out talking about the way that Trump and Putin are interacting or not on the world stage, criticizing each other, congratulating each other or not, etc. Let's watch.
He has also not criticized Vladimir Putin. He's not said that this is a Russian aggression, it needs to stop. But my view is that the reason why he is not criticizing Putin is because he knows he ultimately has to reach a deal with Putin. And so he's not demonizing him. But that doesn't mean that he misunderstands the situation on the ground.
So do you agree with Kurt Volker there? What do you make of what he's saying?
So there's definitely a place for diplomatic maneuvering, and it is possible that what Trump is trying to do is do something like that, where he's in essence getting ready to talk to Putin. However, there's a long history of Trump cozying up to Putin. I mean, think about Helsinki, for example.
Sure.
That becomes a real problem because it doesn't seem, based on the rhetoric and past actions in many cases, you're looking at a situation where what has actually happened here is that Trump is really in line with what Putin's goals are. He, in essence, has said he doesn't care what is going to happen to Ukraine, what is happening to Europe if the Europeans don't pay, certain European countries don't pay their 2% of GDP for NATO, for example. So those are the kinds of issues that are going to have to be resolved. It would be to Trump's advantage to stand by Ukraine in a strategic and in a military sense. The problem is his rhetoric doesn't match the need for that strategic advantage.
How do you think the politics of his MAGA base play into this? Because obviously, Congress, it's been really tough to get Ukraine aid across the finish line.
Well, it's interesting because when you look at the final vote tallies, they've actually been fairly substantial in favor of Ukraine aid. At least that was the past. But with this election, people in office may interpret that as being a sign that they wouldn't support Ukraine, or at least wouldn't support it as much as they have until this point. It would be a huge strategic mistake if they did that. However, they're not thinking that way. They're thinking about short-term political gains, and it could very well be the case that the MAGA base will have a lot of influence on what happens with Ukraine, and that would be a tragedy for Ukraine and then eventually for Eastern Europe.
And what is your sense of how Europeans are taking this in right now? What are they doing to try to prepare for it?
Right now, it seems like there's a lot of panic now. But one thing that's going to be interesting about this, Casey, is that Germany is about to undergo an election, and the likelihood is that the Christian Democratic Union, the CDU, is going to take over in Germany from Chancellor Olaf Scholz. The candidate for the CDU is a pro-Ukraine, right-of-center candidate, and that could potentially galvanize other European nations to, in essence, step into the breach where they actually do provide more support for Ukraine. But from a defense industrial-based standpoint, it's one thing to say things politically. It's quite another to actually deliver the weapons and the munitions that the Ukrainians need.
For sure. All right, Colonel Cedric Leighton for us this morning. Colonel, thank you. Appreciate it.
A massive number of Russian troops are preparing to launch an assault on Ukrainian forces in the coming days.
It's an attempt to push Ukraine out of Russia's Kursk region, where they have held ground since the summer. That plan, according to a US official, includes North Korean troops.
Salma has been watching this. I mean, we've got to, get this in proportion. The number of North Korean soldiers is tiny compared with the broader scale of the Russian military, but nevertheless, they are there.
It's a huge asset for President Putin. According to President Zelensky, there are already 11,000 North Korean troops amassing on those front lines near Kursk. He says that Ukrainian forces have already clashed with these North Korean troops, that there's already been casualties. And for Ukraine, who has struggled, a country that has really struggled to find the manpower to continue to send people to the front lines, at that same time, President Putin is able to tap into a whole other resource of manpower, and that is, of course, North Korean troops. And what President Zelensky fears is that these North Korean troops are going to be used to bolster this push to retake Kursk. You'll remember Kursk inside Russia was where Ukraine launched the surprise offensive a few months ago, taking Russian territory. Now President Putin poised to take it back. And for President Zelensky, the goal behind that, not that he didn't think that Russia would try to retake their territory, of course he expected that, but there was a goal behind Kursk, and that was to soften those front lines, to distract and distribute Russian troops in such a way that may allow Ukrainian forces to push towards the front in the east. None of that has materialized. You also have the biggest drone strikes that are occurring, just this massive onslaught of Russian firepower on Ukraine. 145 drones fired in a single night, Saturday night at Ukraine. After a week that was already so difficult for Ukrainians, Russia fired more than 800 aerial bombs, 600 drone strikes, 20 missiles. That's according to President Zelensky. So you have a country that's very much struggling on those front lines to hold or maintain whatever gains it has, looks like it's on the back foot, could potentially lose Kursk as a gain, a population very far from the front lines suffering under this Russian firepower, and President Zelensky preparing for the possibility of a Trump presidency where he could be forced to a negotiating table at his weakest point yet in this conflict.
Yeah, and on that point, we know that Donald Trump, it emerged yesterday, had spoken to President Putin on Thursday of last week. Among the comments made between the two, Trump apparently reminded him of Washington's sizable military presence in Europe and expressed interest in following up on conversations on the resolution of Ukraine's war soon. How do you read those comments in light of Trump's previous stated goal of finding an end to this war within a day once he was in power?
It's difficult to ascertain what Trump's foreign policy goals are at this time. He's obviously preparing by making these phone calls. He also apparently said in this phone call, don't escalate to President Putin. So he may be trying to sort of freeze things as they are, if he can, in order, again, to bring these warring parties to the negotiating table. But bottom line, I think both Zelensky and Putin expect that Trump will withdraw some level of support from Ukraine, and they are simply making their calculations based on that and what that looks like on the battlefield.
Salma, thank you.